Hello and welcome to this SAGE webinar on the Journal of International Medical Research, JIMR. And this webinar is all about how to get your manuscript published. And my name is Gordon Malarkey. I'm one of the editors of JIMR. So let's get started. So first, some facts about the journal. It's a peer-reviewed open access journal. It publishes original clinical and preclinical research, systematic and narrative reviews, meta-analyses and case reports. It has an official impact factor from Clarivate. And it's indexed in the Science Citation Index Expanded, SCIE, and in PubMed, Medline, Scopus, Embase, Index Medicus, and in the Directory of Open Access Journals. The editors are myself, Gordon Malarkey, and my fellow editor, Dr. Matthew Thorne, and we work for SAGE in London. And we have an associate editor, Dr. Ling Tian, who works from our China office. So firstly, let's look at quality publishing. Now we think JIMR is a high quality journal, so what do we mean by that? Well, it's published by SAGE, who is a highly reputable publisher. As I said, we have an official Clarivate impact factor, and that figure may look a bit low, but that's because we choose to publish case reports as well as studies and reviews that get much more citations. But we believe that case reports are an important part of medical research. And as I said, we're indexed by PubMed and Medline. We've got high standards. And this is something you should look for in any journal. Do they have a clear aims and scope on their website? Do they provide detailed submission guidelines? Do they provide online submission? And do they follow good publishing guidelines such as the ICJME, which is for medical editors, COPE, which is all about publication ethics, and do they follow guidelines such as the Equator Network? I'll come to that later. We've also got high editorial integrity. When we receive any manuscript, we do upfront checks to remove any problem manuscripts, and that includes paper mills and manuscripts that we can see have bad methodology. We then do rigorous peer review, so we get 2 independent peer reviewers to provide comments on any manuscript. And then it's up to me and Dr. Thorne to do the decision making on that. And we do consistent decision making between us, but we won't reject something just because there's certain items missing that we think can be provided. So we'll always provide assistance to authors on how to improve their manuscript at our first decision stage. And then for manuscripts that get accepted, we have a unique in-depth editing of all accepted manuscripts. And that involves copy editing, scientific content editing, and English language editing. And that's very appealing for researchers with English as a second language. And what it does is that it ensures papers are suitable for international readership. And finally, we provide free access to published articles. That's on our website and also on PubMed Central. And here's our website. That's the web address at the top. And you can see the blue arrow. If you click on all articles, you'll get to this page, and you can see that all 9,000 plus articles are free to view on our website. And that's over the last 40 years. So it's, we've been going a long time. If you also look on the right hand side, you'll see that there are sections on the journal description, our aims and scope, editorial board, submission guidelines, and so on. So I thought I'd present a slide on the common reasons that we reject manuscripts. You might find this useful. One of the reasons is that the manuscript is out of scope. So that means that the researchers haven't checked our submission guidelines, that we might find the manuscript suitable for the journal. So please check our submission guidelines. It could be that it's a low quality study, that we do our initial checks and there's just too many mistakes. There's various omissions and the methods are not very good. It could be that we look at it and there's just no innovation or novelty. It's a study that's been reported many times before. So we look for some sort of innovation and novelty, something that will add to the literature. As I say, we do an in-depth English edit once manuscripts are accepted, but if we don't get the basic English correct in the first place, it's very difficult for us to understand the manuscript and for our peer reviewers to understand it. So that can often be a reason for rejection. And then, of course, if anyone has plagiarized their material, or it's a duplication of a paper, we do all of those checks at the beginning. We'll reject any manuscripts like that. Or it could be that the researcher has submitted their manuscript to another journal at the same time, so that's a waste of effort, that two journals are working on it, and we can usually check that out and reject manuscripts where that happens. So preprints, they're okay, but what you must do is in your manuscript include a statement that you've published a preprint and then add the DOI so that readers can access the preprint version. And those are the preprint servers on the right hand side that I mean. So let's move on to some tips on how to get published in JIMR. And I hope you find this guidance handy. It'll just let you know what we're looking for. So the first thing is to follow our guidance. So as I said, read our submission guidelines and use the correct Equator Network checklist for your study. So here's our website again, and this time I've clicked on submission guidelines here at the bottom right, and that brings up this page, which is all of our submission guidelines, including a link to the submission site, and then various points about article types, editorial policies, and how to prepare your paper. And this is the Equator Network that I mentioned. So the website address is at the top there. And what the Equator Network does is that they publish reporting guidelines for the main study types. So you can see for randomized trials, you should use the consort checklist before you to prepare your paper. And for observational studies, it's the strobe checklist, systematic reviews, PRISMA, and so on. Case reports, CARE, animal studies, ARRIVE. There's a whole lot of guidelines there that you can use. So the next thing is to look at authorship. We want clear author details and only include persons who were involved in your research, and try to use the same email address in all your publications. That just assures us that you've published before, because we can easily find your email address online. You should be able to provide your publication record also if we ask for that, and that could be a link to your publication record on PubMed, Google Scholar, Baidu Scholar, ORCID, etc. And this is very important. Please provide a cover letter that explains the relevance and novelty of your study and what it adds to the literature. So that's something that me and my fellow editor really look for, is just to find out what your study is all about, and it helps the peer reviewers as well. And then in our methods section, we need to know the name of your ethics review board, its location, approval number, and the date of approval. And also, if you didn't get or need ethics review board approval, you need to state that you didn't get it. That's also, for some studies, that's okay. And we may ask you for a copy of that approval document as well in our decision-making process. So let's move on to manuscript essentials. And firstly, we'll look at the abstract, introduction, and methods. So the abstract needs to be clear and concise. And you can look at examples on our website. just to see what's been done before. You should mention the type of study in your abstract and method sections. So if it's a case control study, say that it is, and various other types of studies: cross-sectional, cohort, retrospective, prospective, randomized controlled trial, and so on. In the introduction, you should do a short background with key references and up-to-date references, and then state the objectives of your study. In the methods, it's very important that you check that fellow researchers could reproduce your methodology from the description you've given. Now, this is a common problem that peer reviewers ask about. They say, can the methodology be improved? So please try and make sure that your methods are complete. For patient consent, that is required for all prospective clinical studies and clinical trials. And patient details must be de-identified for all studies and case reports. And then we come to statistics. It's important that you select the correct statistical test. Again, this is something that the peer reviewers will check for. And it's good advice that you can check with a statistician, maybe in your hospital or university first, that you've used the correct statistic. And then on certain studies, it's important that you include a sample size calculation. So let's move on to the results, discussion and conclusions. For the results section, make sure that they're clear and concise, and that you use figures and tables to complement the results section. You should also be able to send us original research data if we ask for that. An example here would be for preclinical papers where we'll ask to see your full Western blots. In the discussion section, please compare your results with previous papers and cite those papers, and try and limit self-citation. Only include references that are relevant to your particular study. And you should discuss the relevance and novelty of your study and what it adds to the literature. And then state the limitations of your study and what are your next steps. So that just completes your discussion. And then on to the conclusions. Make sure you don't overstate your conclusions. Bear in mind the type of study. If it's a retrospective study, that's not as powerful as a randomized controlled trial. And also bear in mind the number of patients you've selected or number of animals, because that has a bearing on your statistics. And then finally, there's some additional sections. Have a funding section, and that should include full details about any funding for the study and for any editing. The author contributions state who did what, so that's maybe who conceived the study, who did the research, who wrote the paper, and so on. And then in the acknowledgements, state if you used a medical writing or editing agency. So these are the legitimate third-party agencies that you might ask to help you compile or edit your manuscript. And then finally, a data availability statement, and this is a statement that the study data is available upon request. So these are just additional sections that are required for any manuscript. So let's look at the individual manuscript types for additional considerations, and the first one here is for randomized controlled trials, and you can see in the bottom right I've put the reporting guidelines from Equator here so that you can see what I mean. So firstly, for randomized controlled trials, you need statements about patient consent and de-identification of the patients. And you should follow the Equator guideline, and this is the consort checklist. You can see from the Equator, there's consort there. And you need to register all clinical trials and provide that clinical trial registration number in your manuscript. And they require a sample size calculation. For observational studies, the additional considerations here, again, it's a statement about patient consent, and that's required for all prospective studies. Of course, you can't get that for retrospective studies. And a statement about de-identifying patients. And the Equator guideline here is the strobe checklist. You can see that second there. For case reports, the additional considerations is a statement about patient consent if you obtained this or you did not obtain it, a statement about de-identifying patients, and the equator guideline to use here is the care checklist. For systematic reviews, the additional considerations, here you should use the PRISMA or MOOSE checklist and include the flowchart for these in your manuscript, and all studies should be registered prospectively with Prospero or in Place. For narrative reviews, the additional considerations are that you need to include the scope of your literature research, state that it is a narrative review, and make sure you don't overstate your conclusions. For animal studies, the additional considerations is to ensure that there's adequate care of animals at all stages of your research, and you should use the Guide for the Care and Use of Laboratory Animals, 8th edition, or refer to that. And make sure that the use of anesthetics and research drugs is appropriate. And the equator guideline here is the ARRIVE checklist. For preclinical studies, the additional considerations is to follow appropriate guidelines such as the principles and guidelines for reporting preclinical research. And of course, if your manuscript doesn't contain studies with human participants or animals, then you don't need a consent statement. And this is the website that I mentioned, the Principles and Guidelines for Reporting Preclinical Research. So if you search for that, you'll find that website. So in summary, please follow our submission guidelines and relevant equator guideline. Always include a cover letter for us to read first. Start with a clear introduction with background and recent references, and state your objectives. In your methods section, please include an IRB approval statement, clear and reproducible methods with use of the equator checklist, and use the right statistical test. Make sure your results are concise and accurate, with tables and figures as required. Your discussion needs to compare your results with previous papers, and you should state the novelty of your study and its limitations, and your next steps. And remember not to overstate your conclusions. And then include the final sections on authorship, funding, conflict of interest, and data availability. Okay, so that's the end of the slides, and I hope you found these tips useful in preparing your next manuscript, and I look forward to receiving your next manuscript for the Journal of International Medical Research. Thank you.